Notes for the trivia in a couple weeks. Next week we'll have Zion Hill Cemetery history, which is Celeste Leslie. It's going to be a great lecture. But thank you very much for everybody coming and everything. And then, as every week we do, let's thank Bonnie for putting out a great spread. Everybody can hear Mark. So Mark Stewart, one of my good friends, he's been doing a lot of research on our famous baseball player here in Columbia, which I believe he has the numbers to get in the Hall of Fame. So without further ado, Mark Stewart talking about Jimmy Sheckard. Thank you.
How's the volume back in the cheap seats? Okay. Those of you who know me know I'm more comfortable getting up and just kind of winging it, but we would be here for 3 hours because I'm writing a book about this guy and I know everything. So I'm going to focus a lot on Jimmy Sheckard as a boy, where he came from, his time in Columbia, and all the things that got him to the point where he was a major league superstar. And we'll go over a little bit of that too, but I'm going to leave time at the end for questions because the nature of this is I'll be just glossing over things where I've done a tremendous amount of research, which I find very interesting. Let's see if I can get this going. I'm going to start with this. One of the things I like best about baseball is that as much as the game has evolved and changed, you can look at the statistics of a player from any era and form kind of a mental picture of the kind of player he was. One of the most helpful things to look at is what stat people call black ink. That's shorthand for the bold numbers that are used to indicate that a player has led his league in a particular category. And that's especially helpful in understanding how a player fit into the context of baseball when he played. This is the statistics for Jimmy Rollins. We're all familiar with him. He was a shortstop for the Phillies not too long ago. I guess the point I'm making before I get into Jimmy Sheckard is whatever baseball looks like 50 years from now, a fan who wants to understand what kind of player Jimmy Rollins was can look at Rollins' black ink, and hopefully you can see it here, and instantly know that from the stuff that's bolded, he was a leadoff hitter, was very fast. You don't lead the league in stolen bases and runs if you're not, and if you lead the league in triples 4 times, which he did, you had some pop in your back. And you were an aggressive base runner. In 2007, Jimmy Rollins had a lot of black ink, and he won the MVP award that season. All right, now let's look at Jimmy Sheckard. What does the black ink tell us about Jimmy Sheckard as a player? I think this is a case where black ink makes it really kind of difficult to picture in your mind who Jimmy Sheckard was. If you look closely, you'll see he led the league in stolen bases twice at a time when everyone was stealing bases, so we know he must have been very fast. He led the league in triples, so that tells us he was also an aggressive base runner, just like Jimmy Rollins. He led the league in slugging one year, and in home runs another year, so we know that Jimmy Sheckard had power. He led the league in sacrifice hits, which is a fancy way of saying bunts. So we also know that he could play small ball and was willing to give himself up for the good of the team. Now, if you look down at the bottom, in his 30s, when most players of that era experienced a sharp decline, Jimmy led the league in walks twice, runs scored once, and on-base percentage once too. The bunts and walks, by the way, those numbers, if you can see them, they are historically good numbers. I'll also tell you that Jimmy Sheckard has a ton of black ink on the defensive side. He led the league in putouts, assists, and double plays as a left fielder 4 times, and he still holds the all-time record for double plays by a left fielder, and he holds that record by a lot. And as we'll see, Jimmy was one of the most admired and valuable players on teams that are still regarded among the best of all time. So if you haven't formed a mental picture of him, don't feel bad. Is there a player today who fits the black ink we just saw? No, the answer is no. Was there a player in Jimmy Sheckard's time who was like Jimmy Sheckard? Again, the answer is no. Did baseball fans recognize how uniquely talented he was? Yes, they definitely did. In the 1920s and 30s, after he retired, when power hitters like Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and Jimmy Foxx were taking over the game, a lot of sports writers who lamented the loss of what they called scientific baseball usually mentioned two players who embodied this idea. One was Ty Cobb, a very famous player, and the other was Jimmy Sheckard. They were mentioned in the same breath again and again and again. Now, Ty Cobb is in the Hall of Fame, and he has an ocean of black ink. As for Jimmy Sheckard, he's kind of been lost to history. So who was Jimmy Sheckard? Tonight, I'm going to do my best to answer that question. Jimmy was born November 23rd, 1878 in York County, and he grew up in Columbia, a few blocks from here, in a house that is still standing across the street from Mount Bethel Cemetery. It's a light blue house. You probably have walked by it many, many times. His given name was Samuel James Tilden Sheckard. He was named in honor of Samuel Tilden, a famed corruption fighter who had run for president in 1876. I know we all remember this from high school. And lost a razor-thin election to Rutherford B. Hayes. Tilden won the popular vote that year, but was one vote short of winning the Electoral College. He was prepared to dispute the results, but his fellow Democrats cut a deal to recognize Hayes as president if the Republicans agreed to end Reconstruction. So he took one for the team, literally. Jimmy's father, George Sheckard, regarded Tilden as a man of great integrity. That's why he named his son after him. The Sheckard family moved to Columbia in 1888 when Jimmy was 9. The family had owned 71 acres across the river in Grahamville, which is just north of Shanksbury, but only a fraction of that land that they owned really could be farmed. At the time they moved, America, or just before that, America was in a boom and bust cycle. When Jimmy was a young boy, his family struggled. In 1884, there was a depression that impacted commodity prices, so farming a challenging piece of land like George Sheckard owned would have been nearly impossible. And even though the economy bounced back, George probably recognized at that point that farming was not his thing. He moved to Columbia, where there was a thriving industrial town, as we all know, and he made a good living here, working as a carpenter. So think about 9-year-old Jimmy Sheckard moving to Columbia from being a nature boy to moving to the streets across the street from Mount Bethel Cemetery. It must have been a huge change for him. He had spent his first 9 years largely outdoors, learning how to hunt and fish and splash around in the creeks and streams, and developing an athletic mind and body, great hand-eye coordination. And suddenly in Columbia, he was a new kid in an urban environment. Probably most of us have had a similar experience like that, and that situation can go badly. But in Jimmy's case, he was his quiet self-confidence, his athletic ability, he had an easygoing personality and kind of a mischievous sense of humor. This made him instantly popular. So that bar was high, but he got over it very easily. It was also here in Columbia that he was introduced to team sports for the first time. There was the national game of baseball, of course, and a relatively new game of football. So real quick, where did the Sheckards come from and when did they arrive in America? This next part I could spend an hour on. I won't, I promise. But I always think it's fascinating to understand what makes a person or what made a person take a huge risk of coming to America in the 1700s and 1800s. It was just, even if you had a lot of money, it was just not an easy journey. And it's really good to understand, what were the motivating factors. Jimmy's grandfather was Johann Sheckard. Now, that's not the good German pronunciation, but that's the phonetic pronunciation, Sheckard. He was born in 1811 and lived in the city of Karlsruhe. This was a pretty affluent city on the Rhine in southwestern Germany in the state of Baden. It was affluent because the ruler of Baden, Grand Duke Charles, sided with Napoleon at the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, which of course we all remember in great detail, when the French defeated the Austrian and Russian armies. As a reward, Napoleon quadrupled the size of Baden. So Johann Sheckard grew up in what we would now call kind of a buffer state between France and the Prussians, with all the advantages that come to having a guy like Napoleon on your side, feeding you money. During Johann's adulthood, there were crop failures and food shortages in Europe, some failed revolutions in 1830, and overpopulation in general that drove agricultural workers into cities like Karlsruhe, which pushed down wages and living conditions. These were some of the dynamics that actually sowed the seeds of the chaos that became sort of the revolutionary violence that swept across Europe in 1848. And southwestern Germany, where he lived, that was ground zero of some of the worst of it. So you always wonder what pushes somebody out to take that journey. In this case, what's interesting is that Johann must have seen it coming. He was not a wealthy man, nor was he an educated man, but he managed to save enough money to bring his wife and infant son to America in 1845, 3 years before. 3 years before the revolutions of 1848. So Jimmy Sheckard was known for his great anticipations in the outfield, but maybe this is where it came from. Who knows? Anyway, Schweikart sailed from Hamburg to Baltimore and then made their way up Chesapeake Bay to the Susquehanna River. They disembarked in the vicinity of Shanks Ferry and settled in Chanceford Township, which was one of York County's more affordable farming areas. And it was also home to lots of German speakers. Many of the captured Hessians during the Revolution were held in this area, and they stayed in York County after the war. Hessen, where they came from, was a neighboring state to Baden, and the Schweikarts had roots there too. So, you know, you can kind of assume they chose this area. I mean, you can't just come to America and go up the river and get off the boat, right? You had to have a plan. We're assuming they chose this area based on what they maybe had read and heard about York County in the places where they had come from. The Schweikarts had 3 more children in Pennsylvania, including Jimmy's father, George, who was born in 1848. All but one survived to adulthood. Johann moved his family to Peachbottom and was living there when the Civil War started, living right on the Mason-Dixon line, basically. Can you imagine having taken your family across the ocean to avoid civil war in your homeland, only to find yourself right in the thick of it, which he was. Of course, the Gettysburg invasion went to the west, so, and he was too old. Johann, Jimmy's grandfather, was too old to serve, and his 2 young sons were teenagers, so they managed to adopt them. Now, interestingly, at this point, we see the anglicization of the family's name. Johann Sr. and Jr., the father and the young son who came over from Germany, they now went by John. And the family name was now Sheckard, with an E-R-T or an A-R-T at the end. The German W is a soft one, so it wasn't a huge change phonetically. I've been saying Schweikart, it's more like Sheckard. You can see how it went from that to where it is now. George grew up. He married a woman named Sarah Jane Cruson, who went by Sally. This is Jimmy's mother. And they had their first of 8 children in 1869. Her birth record spells Sheckard with a D, so that's how we get to the D in Sheckard. Jimmy came along 9 years later, as I said, in 1878. The black ink that I mentioned before may have some of you imagining that Jimmy Sheckard was built like kind of an NFL linebacker, an NBA guard. He did all these incredible things. He was fast, he was powerful, but he was relatively small and slight in stature. In his prime years as a professional baseball player, he stood no taller, I think, than 5'9", and probably weighed about 170 pounds. Solid, but certainly not an imposing person. So it's interesting to see basically a little man doing big things on the national stage of baseball. So how did he get there? Okay. So at the age of 14, where we pick up this story in Columbia, Jimmy was nowhere near this big at that point. However, as a young teenager, he was already holding his own against older boys and men on the baseball diamond. Jimmy had a quick left-handed bat and a powerful right arm. Hit lefty or righty. His throws were described as Sheckard cannonballs. And from what I can tell, it's not because they exploded. I think it's because they made an audible hiss when he cut loose. It would be the sound of a cannonball flying over your head. Obviously, you don't want to be near where you can hear the explosion, so it's just an assumption. So at this point, in the early 1890s, as many of you know, Columbia was an industrial powerhouse. The population now is around 10,000, right? Okay, it was 12,000 people lived in town. And there were manufacturing jobs for skilled and unskilled workers. This type of employment was hard and was dirty and demanded tremendous physical strength, and baseball games were a popular diversion in town. And not surprisingly, the game was played with great skill and competence on the amateur level and also the semi-pro level here. Semi-pro is basically you're getting paid a couple of bucks a game to play, but you had a regular job. And Columbia was at the point where if a semi-pro team in town needed a better player at a particular position or a particular game, it was no problem importing one from another town. Because a position on a team here would have come with possibly with a position in a factory, which meant 2 paychecks. For many ball players in the 19th century, this was preferable to playing professionally because organized baseball, even in the 1890s, was really kind of disorganized. Teams and leagues were folding all the time, and if you were a player on an organized baseball team and they just went out of business, you were probably stranded in a strange city, and you were waiting for a paycheck that wasn't going to come. So anyway, at age 14, Jimmy's body and his mind were developing at a time when baseball was Columbia's prestige sport. So we're in the year 1893, and it's worth noting something really important happened in baseball that year. The distance from the pitching rubber to home plate had been increased from 50 feet to 60 feet 6 inches. That's a big difference, and this happened during his boyhood. Okay, there was a brief stop in the middle around 55, and they did this because overhand pitching was legal now, and batters were just being overwhelmed pitchers who were thrown from 50 feet. So pitchers older than Jimmy had a difficult time adjusting, as you might imagine, but Jimmy was literally growing into the new rules as he was growing. The distance went into effect at precisely the time, in 1893, that Jimmy was starting to kind of flash these adult-like skills. The game seemed really fast and difficult to most people at that point. For him, he was slowing down. So here we have now, at age 16, 1895, he's playing, at this point playing with boys his age just made no sense to him anymore, and he decided, I'm going to be a semi-pro ball player. The competition was better, we're going to make a few dollars a game, and the only question was, which team would I choose? Which team would he play for? And something else to understand about Jimmy Sheckard, as we'll see, is his answer to that question was, why choose one? We're going to get back to that in a moment. First, like most young men in Columbia, Jimmy went to work at age 16. He found a job at one of the steel rolling mills where he handled iron rails as they came out of the furnace. This was dangerous, unpleasant work, but it improved his strength and stamina. During breaks, he would toss a ball on the factory's regular roof and then wait to see where it came down and then sprint to catch it before it hit the ground. And this improved his quickness, his coordination, reaction time. You can imagine if you're working on these horrible factories and you finally get a break, you see this kid running around, catching balls off the roof. They must have thought he was crazy. Jimmy's first serious team was the Marietta YMCA. Back then, the YMCA's had teams and they would pay their players, at least the veterans. It was managed by a guy named John Brenner, who all his life took credit for discovering Jimmy, and in a way he did. He put Jimmy on the pitching mound. And almost, he's 16 now, he's just wiping batters out. He's got this explosive fastball, he's got a curve that breaks very sharply, and it's worth noting that the balls used in the 1890s, they softened very quickly during games, so a good pitcher could really make them move around. So the guys who are facing Jimmy, they decided maybe the best way to deal with him was to bunt. But they were kind of just doing him a favor because it kept his pitch count down. And he was such a good fielder, he would pounce off the mound and easily throw the guys out at first base. So if he didn't have 10 strikeouts in the game, it was very possible he'd have 10 assists. So there was sort of no dealing with him at this point. Also remember that most pitchers in this era only crank up their fastballs when necessary, since they were expected to go 9 innings. They were supposed to finish what they started. Jimmy threw hard all the time. And that wasn't even happening in the majors until much, much later. When Jimmy wasn't pitching, he usually played shortstop, where his aggressiveness and his throwing arm made him a pretty good standout player too. Jimmy also started to make a name for himself as a hitter. He had an unusually good batting eye and was patient enough to wait for a pitch he could handle. As an adult player, this skill would eventually develop into a philosophy that drove opposing pitchers absolutely crazy. He would not swing at any pitch that was not an obvious strike. Of course, at this point, he's a teenager, so he's still a free swinger having a lot of fun. but he had an incredible batting eye. In the summer of 1895, the Cuban Giants, an independent club made up of African-American stars, scheduled a stop in Colombia. Black baseball teams visit Colombia regularly, the competition was good, and their cut of the game was good too, because the town had a very large African-American population, so they would get a full house almost every time. In this particular game, their opponent, the Columbia Athletic Association, which was a major semi-pro team in town, they found themselves short of a player at game time, and they approached Jimmy, and he was asked to step in and play the outfield. So this is origin story for someone. This is as close as we could find. The Giants naturally slaughtered the Colombians, but Jimmy was the standout. Despite being the youngest player on the field, he had his team's only hit, a screaming triple that people were talking about for years. So this game is said to have launched Jimmy's serious baseball career. And of course, he immediately jumped from his team in Marietta to the York YMCA for a better, slightly better payday. And over the next 2 years, he would pitch and play for a number of semi-pro teams in the area, as well as some minor league clubs. And in a given season, he might play for 3 or 4 or 5 teams. You know, he just wanted to play and pick up a little cash. He saw it as, I'm walking down the street, I could work for this pharmacy, I could work for that pharmacy. Why do I have to play for one? So that was kind of his attitude. I also found out that he was on the mound for the 1896 season opener for Franklin and Marshall, even though there's absolutely no record of his being a student there. So, people weren't passing around, photos of guys, right? So, now, he wasn't indestructible, nobody is. Throwing 200 or 300 pitches a week finally caught up with him, and there were some days where apparently he couldn't lift his right arm above his shoulder. So the soreness he was experiencing and his penchant for occasional wildness made it clear to him that maybe his future in baseball was not going to be on the pitching end. Get back to that in a second. I mentioned football earlier, so let me talk about that for a moment. At the same time Jimmy was making a name for himself on the baseball diamond, he was playing for the Olympic Football Club of Columbia every fall. This was an amateur team that played and beat semi-pro clubs, railroad teams, athletic associations that used college players as ringers. They were good. Jimmy played for Columbia for 6 years, well past the point that he was a Major League Baseball star. If you lived in Columbia during this time, you were just as likely to see his name in a football headline as a baseball headline. All right, back to baseball, but I do have one more football story. In the late summer of 1896, Jimmy, who was all of 17 years old, found himself playing for the Portsmouth Browns of the Virginia League. This was a legitimate, organized minor league team with veteran players. He was young looking for his age. You can sort of see from this picture here. His presence must have been viewed with some skepticism by the fans and his teammates, but that changed quickly. The Portsmouth Star reported in a news article that Sheckard had a chance to show what metal he was made of and came up to all expectations. His work in the field and at the bat were gilt-edged. If I wrote that way now, I'd be fired. So anyway, at a remarkably young age, Jimmy understood something fundamental about baseball. You want to get inside the head. When you breathe life into someone who played 140 years ago, you want to try and get inside their head. And what's the difference between him and everybody else? He understood that baseball was all about accumulating bases and producing outs. And what would set him apart from that point forward was how quickly his mind calculated the probabilities and the outcomes and the creativity with which he got those bases, and how he got those outs. He was just always thinking about a new way to be better and to help his team win. So over the winter, Jimmy went out into the world. He signed to play for a minor league club in Brockton, Massachusetts, which is a town about 3 times larger than Columbia. They make shoes, so of course the team was called the Brockton Shoemakers, and they did very well at the gate. It was also a factory town, so they were the main entertainment there. They also made money developing players to sell to the major leagues. This is what we now call sort of the high minors, I guess you would say. The manager there played Jimmy at shortstop, knowing that this was an in-demand position in the National League, even though Jimmy at this point probably was not a great shortstop. He was sort of overly aggressive. At age 18, Jimmy quickly became the New England League's best hitter. He won the batting championship with a .377 average. He led the league with 53 stolen bases. Brockton won the New England League pennant. And that fall, the Shoemakers sold Jimmy to the Brooklyn Bridegrooms, who are now the Los Angeles Dodgers. And he was playing in the majors in September of 1897. Back then, the major league teams would allow the press to nickname their teams. In the 1890s, the Brooklyn team had a bunch of players who all got married roughly at the same time, so they were called the Bridegrooms. And later, in a minute, we'll talk about they got a new manager at some point called Ned Hanlon, who's now in the Hall of Fame. So when he came to Brooklyn, the press changed the name of the team from the Bridegrooms to the Superbas, because there was a very famous vaudeville act, like an acrobat act called Hanlon's Superbas. So they just decided they would name them the Superbas. They were also calling them the Trolley Dodgers at that point, so all these things were sort of a soup of baseball names back then. So Jimmy arrived in Brooklyn at the very end of the 1897 season, and he immediately warned the manager that he was probably better suited for the outfield than the infield, and he went ahead and proved this point by committing 19 errors in 11 games at shortstop. Now, normally this would have earned an 18-year-old a permanent spot on the bench, but during that same span, Jimmy had gone from the bottom of the batting order to the heart of the lineup and was moved to the outfield just to keep his bat in the lineup for the team. In a short time, he came up to the plate 61 times. He drew 6 walks. I'm not through the math here, but he drove in 14 runs with 14 hits. So obviously he was good in the clutch. His slugging average was .612, by far the best on a ball club full of veteran major leaguers. And then on September 17th, Jimmy became the youngest right fielder in history to hit a home run, a record that would stand for another 63 years. Greg Dubbs probably knows who broke it. He's the only man who hasn't made it. So Columbia had produced some good ball players over the years, but Jimmy was the first to make it all the way to the top of the national game. After his debut in Brooklyn, he came home to a hero's welcome in Columbia and immediately suited up for the football team. So here's the last football story. Jimmy was now captain of the Columbia Olympics, and they hosted a game in November against the semi-pro team from New York, who had already beaten college teams from Gettysburg, Franklin Marshall, and Dickinson, so they were good. This was an important game, a lot of money being given. So 2 members of the University of Pennsylvania football team were paid to travel to Columbia to serve as referees. Everything had to be up and up. Columbia scored the first touchdown, but they missed the extra point. York got the ball, drove down the field to the Columbia goal line for what was likely going to be the tying score, followed by potentially the game-winning extra point. So things were looking bleak for Columbia when York called actually an illegal play. Back then, only certain players were allowed to touch the ball after the center snapped it. While the players stood around waiting for the 2 officials to confer on the penalty, Jimmy noticed that no one had blown the whistle yet. So therefore, the ball was still live. He picked up the football, ran 99 yards, and went in for a touchdown the other way. Now the 2 officials, needless to say, they called the play back. So Jimmy pulled his team off the field. And the Penn guys announced that if the Olympics didn't return to the field within 20 minutes, the game would be forfeited to York. So picture this, everyone's got a lot of money on the line. There's a big controversy. Star players pulled his team off the field. The visiting York supporters started celebrating because they figured either way they were going to leave town with cash in their pockets. I can't tell you what a bad idea this was. The Columbia fans kind of closed in around the York fans, and basically a riot broke out. And they beat them up pretty badly. The 2 Penn referees kind of froze there. This is on the newspaper accounts. Great to read these. They didn't know what to do next, right? They didn't know if the game's going to continue, if they're going to break up the fight. They had no idea. Now these were well-educated young men, so at some point they figured out that after the Colombians finished off the York fans, they might be next on the menu. The York Dispatch reported the officials showing great discretion for their tender years were last seen clambering hurriedly over the fence which surrounded the field. Back to baseball. Jimmy was penciled in as the everyday left fielder for Brooklyn in 1898. He missed a bunch of games due to illness and injury, but he was the team's best run producer and one of their best sluggers. He's still a teenager. The bridegroom center fielder was someone named Fielder Jones. He was one of the smartest men in baseball. He played beside Jimmy. He was a great tutor for Jimmy, both on and off the field. Jones helped Jimmy develop the sixth sense he had for changing where he positioned himself in the outfield, not only for each batter, but he would move in each game situation, each pitch count. And he was celebrated for this skill, and I think he learned a lot of that from this guy, Fielder Jones. It was unusual at the time. Most guys just sort of stand in the same place. Jones was also very clear-eyed about the business of baseball and where the players had power and where they did not. This was a guy who invested in oil wells, in a general store, and he imbued Jimmy with an appreciation of the inherent unfairness of contracts in baseball at that time. This comes into play shortly. National League owners capped player salaries at $2,400 heading into the 1899 season. This fattened their profits. So the biggest stars in the game, didn't matter. You're going to get paid $2,400. That's that. They were looking at their bottom line, fatten their profits, but this was going to backfire in a couple of years because it opened the door for the American League to begin, and they started a huge bidding war. The salaries got out of control. Another thing that was happening in baseball at this time among the owners is that they were also increasing their profits by forming syndicates. It's a word that we don't hear much anymore. It's kind of a dirty word in business. They would acquire, if you can imagine, controlling interest in two big league clubs. So the owner of the Pirates would buy the Louisville club, for instance. They would then arrange trades that would concentrate their veteran stars on one team and leave the other team with almost no chance of succeeding. This was considered good business back then. Obviously, it wouldn't fly these days. These were sham trades, and sometimes in these trades, the powerful team would send young players with potential in the other direction, if they could get more playing time and experience with the crappy team. Prior to the 1899 season, Brooklyn hired Ned Hanlon, who I mentioned earlier, to manage the team. Hanlon was part owner of the Baltimore Orioles of the National League, one of the great teams of the 1890s. And when he came over to Brooklyn, he still owned the Orioles, but he was managing Brooklyn, and he brought with him two of his greatest stars, Willie Keeler and Joe Kelly. If you're a baseball fan, you'll recognize those players as Hall of Famers. So actually, Brooklyn went on to win the pennant, the championship in 1899, but Jimmy Sheckard was not part of the celebration because he was the guy sent back to Baltimore in this big trade. The 1899 season was not a total loss for Jimmy, however. He was taken under the wing of John McGraw and Wilbur Robinson, who ran the Orioles. They were the holdovers from these pennant-winning teams in Baltimore from earlier in the decade, and they were probably the two smartest men in baseball. Jimmy played right field, and he led the National League with 77 stolen bases. Again, everyone's stealing bases. He's leading the league. And it was during this season in Baltimore, he also started to learn how to use his keen batting eye to work out walks and to wear down pitchers. At this point, he was unafraid to work deep into counts, which was a thing back then. The most embarrassing thing you could do was strike out. So you didn't want to get to the point where you were 0-2, taking pitches. So he learned how to get on base however he could. This was also a specialty of John McGraw. Also at this time, interestingly, foul balls did not count as strikes. It was one of the last years where this was the case. So if you're a really patient hitter, eventually you're either going to get a ball you can really hit or you draw a base on the ball. So he really understood this and worked it well. Again, he's 20 years old. In Baltimore, Jimmy also found a way to incorporate the footwork and the glove work from his days as a shortstop and his strength of his throwing arm as a pitcher into a whole new kind of an outfield play. At the end of this year in Baltimore, he had thrown out 33 runners, including 14 double plays. If you don't play baseball, those numbers are meaningless, but these were historic numbers. And this would become his calling card, the ability to throw guys out from the outfield. In fact, a special ruse he developed came to be known as the Jimmy Sheckard play, and it was called that long after he retired. And I'm going to try and describe how this works. You're not going to see it. I'm going to. So with runners on first and second, Jimmy would allow a short, catchable fly ball to drop in front of him, but he was running full tilt towards the infield, and he short hopped the ball with all his momentum going forward, and then fired the ball to second base. The runner on second is frozen in place. He doesn't know whether he's got to go to third, or he's got to go back, and the ball's coming so quickly, the second baseman or the shortstop, usually the shortstop in this case, this right fielder, would tag the guy who's frozen there outside of second base, and then just step on second base to force the guy who's coming from first. Apparently, a couple of times this happened, and the batter who's sort of watching this horror unfold in front of him forgets that he still has to run to first base, and they would throw to first base and get a triple play. So this is the Jimmy Sheckard play. There's another version of this, which I'll get into in a second. What made the play so effective was that Jimmy was already known for his ability to make impossible shoestring catches. Does everyone know what a shoestring catch is? It's running in the ball off your shoestrings. Heading into the 1900 season, the next phase of the syndicate scheme, which I mentioned before, took place. The National League decided to just eliminate its four sisters in Washington, Louisville, Cleveland, and Baltimore. Jimmy played for Baltimore. So the question was, who owned Jimmy Sheckard? He was one of the most valuable young players in baseball all of a sudden. And since the Orioles had ceased to exist, Jimmy figured he was a free agent, and for all intents and purposes, he probably was. This is a very new thing happening in baseball. Most of the guys who were on those bad teams were bad players, and Jimmy had this unique position, right? Who owned Jimmy Sheckard? This is where things get very interesting. That January, John McGraw was spotted getting off a train at the Columbia Station. McGraw had been granted a franchise in the American League, and he hoped to sign Jimmy. Ned Hanlon and the Brooklyn owner, Charlie Ebbets Field, were also spotted in Columbia too. Jimmy signed a contract with McGraw because he knew him and liked him and trusted him. And now he was a member of the new Baltimore Orioles, now an American League team. And he received a very nice advance on his salary as an incentive, which would have cash over the winter time. Brooklyn wasn't through. They took advantage of Jimmy's youth. Hanlon and Everts returned to Columbia and convinced him that they held his legal option. So Jimmy signed a contract with Brooklyn. He's got two contracts. Now, if you know anything about John McGraw, you know he was just losing his mind at this point. He returned to Columbia and talked Jimmy into signing another contract. And this time he tried to hide Jimmy by taking him to Hot Springs, Arkansas. But they figured out where he was, and Ebbets talked him into coming back to Columbia, where he met him and he offered him the league maximum of $2,400 plus $600 more under the table. It's always his dream to make $5,000 a year. So this got him to $3,000. So even the owners were breaking their own rules at this point. And then on top of that, they dragged Jimmy to Philadelphia, where a lawyer had him, acknowledge the fact, yes, Brooklyn does own the rights, and then he had him sign another contract. This was the fourth one. In a course of weeks. So McGraw was just losing at this point. He hired his own attorney who sued Brooklyn, but at least two judges who looked at the case suggested that the reserve clauses in all the contracts at that time, which tied a player to a club for life, we don't have that anymore because of free agency, they lacked mutuality and therefore might be unenforceable. No one on either side wanted to poke that tiger, and the suit was dropped. That was the thing that enabled Major League Baseball to survive as a business. As for Jimmy, from that day forward, he was known alternatively as Jumpin' Jimmy or the Human Grasshopper. And they shouted him from the stands. Not that they didn't like him, they just found it amusing that, every time they pick up the paper, he's jumping from one to another. Brooklyn repeated as National League champions in 1900, and this time Jimmy was part of the fun. He bagged 300 as the fourth outfielder behind Willie Keeler, Joe Kelly, Fielder Jones, the guys I mentioned before. In 1901, this was the big breakout year. Jimmy became a full-fledged superstar. He batted .354, led the league with 19 triples. He had 11 home runs, which was an impressive total in the kind of cavernous ballparks at the time, and he batted in 104 runs, which was the best number of his career. He also had a .534 slugging average, which was the best in the National League. And crowds really liked him. They sort of adored him, even the enemy crowds. Even though he seemed a little bit reserved, he could be loud and funny, and apparently had great comic timing and a little bit of temper also. He loved the banter of the fans, and he was one of these guys who was likely to do something extraordinary on the field at any moment. He was one of those people you never took your eyes off of. About ballparks, I'm often asked to explain why ballparks in the 1800s and early 1900s had such large dimensions. That's why there are so few home runs. Seating in these ballparks usually extended out from behind home plate down the left and right field lines, from the grandstand in the middle. This was the most economical way to accommodate fans. On the rare occasions when all the tickets were sold for a game, teams would then open up the outfield and allow fans to sit in a roped-in area along the fence line. Only a few parks at this time had small areas that I guess we would call bleachers. The cheap seats were down the left and right field lines, and because the outfield fences made up the rest of the square, this created a very large plane. So one of the things Jimmy was noted for, his speed and his anticipation of fielding. He would be able to catch fly balls that would normally be triples, which was a very important skill to have. In 1901, he had this great year, but Brooklyn did not win the pennant for a third year in a row. And I think I mentioned by this time they were being called the Superbas. At the end of that season, in 1901, in September, there were two interesting occurrences involving Jimmy. During a series in Cincinnati against the Reds, he hit inside the park grand slams in back-to-back games. That had never been done before, and hasn't been done since. It seems likely that no one's going to challenge that record. So, not all records are going to be broken. Also that September, Brooklyn played a game in Columbia, right here. A combination of rainouts and the assassination of President McKinley had kind of wreaked havoc in the schedule, and the Superbas found themselves with several days off and a long train ride from Chicago back to New York. This time, Jimmy was a huge star, the toast of Columbia. Charlie Evans arranged a stopover to play Columbia Athletic Association team, and Jimmy was presented with several gifts when he came to bat in the first inning. He then got the best gift of all, a fat pitch from his friend Charlie McCackman, which he drove over the right field fence at East End Field and on the Barber Street. Kind of picture where that is. So here we go again. After Jimmy's big breakout season in 1901, John McGraw pursued him again to play for the Orioles, this time with $1,000 advance on his 1902 salary. Now at this point, as I mentioned, there's an all-out war between the American National League for talent, and stars were jumping left and right. So Jimmy's figured, what the heck? And he signed with Baltimore, even though he still had a contract with Brooklyn. And he actually played 4 games for the Orioles, but then he had a change of heart after a week or so, and he returned to Brooklyn. And I think it was because there had been a court decision involving Napoleon Lajoie, who was a big superstar of Philadelphia Athletics, and he had been barred from ever playing baseball in Pennsylvania again. I think Jimmy was scared into honoring his National League contract, so he went back to Brooklyn. And he played there the next 3 seasons, and he had another sensational year in 1903. He led the National League with 9 home runs and 67 stolen bases. That's a really interesting power-speed combination. Part of his success as a base runner is he had become an expert at sliding to avoid a tag, even when the ball beat him to the base. He also had that year 36 outfield assists, and he had sort of elevated the Jimmy Sheckard play to kind of an art form. Players just didn't know what to do when the ball was coming this way. His combination of home runs and stolen base championships that year was the first time that had been accomplished in the modern era, which was not that old at that time. But since then, only Ty Cobb and Chuck Klein, who was a player for the Phillies, have matched that in 120 years. So it was a rare thing then and still a rare thing now. Following the 1904 season, Jimmy married Cora Seifrieds, the Columbia girl in her mid-20s. Married life seemed to agree with Jimmy, and he had a solid season in 1905 after kind of a down year in 1904. But even so, Charlie Evans let it be known that Jimmy was available. Frank Chance of the Cubs came calling. Chance was a star first baseman, and he had just been anointed field manager of the Cubs. I thought he was one of the greats, and I was willing to do almost anything to get him, Chance said after the trade was made. He also admitted to reporters that he would have thrown in a couple more players, if that's what it would take him to get him to Chicago. Later, Evans claimed that he could swindle him, and he had. Jimmy Sheckard turned out to be the missing piece in Chicago's championship puzzle. Chance batted Jimmy second between the center fielder, Jimmy Slagle, and right fielder, Wildfire Schulte, and together they formed the famous S outfield, with all of their names started with S. The new team was a perfect fit for Jimmy. The Cubs were always working on trick plays, and Jimmy worked with shortstop Joe Tinker to add a new wrinkle to the Sheckard play. On high pops to shortstop, or I should say high pops to short left with runners on first and second, Tinker would settle under the ball and then purposely let it drop just behind him. And if Jimmy's racing in from left field, he would scoop up the ball and gun it to Johnny Evers at second base, who would tag out the runner, retreating to second, and force out the play to first. This was just something that happened all the time. No one was sure what to do on a short ball with Jimmy Sheckard. As I mentioned, he was recognized as the master of the shoestring catch. That was considered a remarkable skill in the early 20th century. You know, today's players can snag a ball in the webbing of their glove. In 1900, there was no webbing. A glove was basically a padded version of your hand. You can go online and see the old things. And the fingers were not even laced together. In the later stages of Jimmy Sheckard's career, you started seeing like a couple of leather strings between the thumb and forefinger. That was about it. So shoestring catch was a two-handed play that took incredible skill. So what was his impact on the team? The Cubs improved from 92 wins in 1905 to 116 in 1906, which was Jimmy's first season. They played the White Sox in the 1906 World Series. They were the heavy favorites, but lost 4-2. Jimmy was actually injured towards the end of the year and had a historically bad World Series. He just couldn't get a hit. The Cubs won the pennant again the next year, in 1907. They defeated Ty Cobb and the Detroit Tigers in the World Series. Jimmy received a gold watch, sort of watch charm, that showed Atlas with a tiger flung over his shoulder and a diamond in the tiger's teeth. And his description read, presented to James T. Sheckard, member of Chicago National League Baseball Club, by the National Commissioner for winning the 1907 World's Baseball Championship. Obviously, Raiders were being paid by the letter like that. And just about everyone in Columbia got to see it there. That was a big deal. It was in the newspapers all the time. The Cubs won their third pennant in a row in 1908, and they beat the Tigers again in the World Series. Jimmy had the lowest batting average of his career that season, but Chance kept him in that number 2 spot because he had become a master at moving runners over and also wearing down enemy pitchers by refusing to swing, as I mentioned before, at anything that was not an obvious strike. It was not unusual for Jimmy to burn up 24 or more pitches in a game. Today, they take a guy out after 100 pitches. Imagine one guy taking a quarter of those pitches. And in the days before closers came in to save games, this resulted in a lot of tired starters in the 8th and 9th innings, which led to a lot of late inning victories. Everyone understood his value to the team, and they wanted him high in the lineup so he could do what he does best. The Cubs won the pennant again in 1910, but they lost to the Athletics in the World Series. We have a picture. Athletics, here's Jimmy right here. And you can see, he's kind of a kind of sprite, right? It's kind of muggy for the camera, you know. You get a little bit, I would say, Greg has a lot of pictures. That's kind of the one that really captures it. Yeah, yeah. So they played the Athletics in the World Series, but they lost 4 games to 1. Jimmy got a 9th inning single in Chicago's only victory, which turns out to have been the first walk-off hit in the World Series history. And he got it off Charlie Bender, Chief Bender, who's a Hall of Fame pitcher, also from Pennsylvania. And they, for decades after, they competed in these sports dinners and things like that. And he was always reminding Bender, hey, I got the game when you hit off. Bender would always say, yeah, we've got the World Series ring. So something's never changed. So now Jimmy, in the early teens, he was in his 30s, but he was still a huge star. That being said, he probably sensed that his speed and his power were fading. In 1911, he decided the best way he could give the Cubs an edge was to reach base as often as possible, doing whatever it took. And this was the black ink I mentioned down at the very bottom. So naturally, Jimmy went all in on this approach, and the result was 147 walks, 44 more than the second-place finisher, and the most in Major League history. His record would stand until Babe Ruth drew 150 walks in 1920, but consider this, every walk issued to Babe Ruth was to some degree an intentional walk, right? No one ever walked Jimmy Sheckard on purpose. And Jimmy, after he retired, used to joke that Ruth could have stood backwards in the batter's box with his eyes closed and still draw walks. And that year, Jimmy's .434 on base percentage was also tops in the league. So he's still leading the league and stuff as a fading player. Not surprisingly, Jimmy led the team with 120 runs scored that year. More surprising was that he was still the #1 base stealer on the Cubs with 32. In 1912, Chicago's opponents kind of got wise to what Jimmy was doing, and they threw him a lot more strikes, but he still managed to lead the majors in walks with 122, and that was the last bit of black ink in his career in 1912. Unfortunately, the Cubs finished in 3rd place in 1912. The old championship club had had its last hurrah, and Jimmy really didn't figure into any kind of rebuilding plan. He was traded to the St. Louis Cardinals after the season, after the 1912 season. They were managed by Miller Huggins, who was a great admirer of Jimmy's ability to get on base, but basically Jimmy was done as a ball player at this point, and the Cardinals realized this, and during the 1913 season, they traded him to the Reds, and 1913 was his final season in the major leagues. So, although the Hall of Fame would not open for another 25 years, baseball fans of that era would not have questioned whether Jimmy Sheckard ranked among the all-time greats. His lifetime average was .274, which was pretty good for the dead ball era. And he finished with 2,084 hits and 1,090 walks. That made him one of the few players of that time to reach base more than 3,000 times. That was an extraordinary number back then. He also stolen 456 bases and scored over 1,200 runs. So he had the numbers, as they say. One thing everyone agreed on at that time, too, was that Jimmy Sheckard would make a fantastic big league manager. However, for one reason or another, the opportunity never materialized. And no one really could figure out why. It was a huge frustration for Jimmy for the rest of his life. And he managed in the minors, and he coached the Great Lakes naval team in north of Chicago during World War I, and then he returned briefly to the Cubs as a coach. But over the years, he was constantly passed over for a big league job. And, I tried to figure out why. It wasn't like he was a fall-down drunk, he wasn't, he didn't have 10 illegitimate kids, all the things that would take you out of the running for these things. He just was always second or third choice. So Jimmy had business interests in Columbia and Lancaster, and he decided to move back home where he could work and also coach baseball locally. His mother passed away in 1919, and his wife filed for divorce the same year. So without baseball, the income was down, and obviously this frustration was affecting their marriage. But in 1924, Jimmy was remarried to another Columbia girl, Fanny Eves, who was 12 years younger. And she brought her nephew, Eugene, into the marriage, and he lived with them through his teen years. As for Jimmy, he played ball well into his 40s, sometimes for semi-pro clubs locally. There's a really good one in Mountville, and occasionally in Old Timers games and things like that. He and Leo Houck, I think I got that name right, were frequently teammates. Houck was the other famous sports star from this area, and he was best known as a professional prize fighter. There was another teammate who he played ball with around here named Snake Deal out of Lancaster. I know him because he played briefly for the Cincinnati Reds as a professional baseball player, but he was known as one of the great professional basketball players in the really, really early years of professional basketball. As a coach, Jimmy helped develop a couple of major leaguers, including Les Bell, who was a World Series star for the Cardinals. So he was doing a good job coaching and finding talent. He was sort of a de facto scout for the Tigers briefly. But he had a business. I think he was selling cars in a Ford dealership here on Lincoln Highway. Anyway, for several years, Jimmy traveled to baseball's winter meetings, hoping to get hired as a coach. But as I mentioned, without any luck. In 1926, the National League celebrated its 50th anniversary, and sports writers were asked at that time to pick their all-time great teams, as you can imagine. Grant Rice, who was sort of the dean of sports writers at that time, he had Jimmy as all-time best left fielder. In 1929, the Lancaster New Era ran a story titled, "Critic Rates Jimmy Sheckard as Keenest and Smartest Outfielder." And the critic was James Crusenberry, who was president of the Baseball Writers Association of America. So even long after he retired, his skills were still well remembered. Unfortunately, when the stock market crashed in 1929, like many Americans, Jimmy lost half his wealth in a matter of days. Unfortunately, he panicked and put his remaining money into riskier stocks, and by 1930 he was basically wiped out. Franklin Marshall hired him to coach baseball in 1930, but the school canceled its 1931 season as the depression worsened, so that was a one-year gig. Jimmy picked up work where he could, spoke at sports dinners, and continued to coach semi-pro ball. Ed Stump involved Jimmy in the design of the baseball stadium he built in Lancaster. But Jimmy's prospects were dimming at this point. In 1937, Connie Mack, an old friend, offered Jimmy a chance to manage a minor league club that he controlled in the Eastern Shore League. Mack thought this might put Jimmy back on the path to a major league coaching job, but Jimmy declined the offer, which I think he later regretted. By the end of the 1930s, Jimmy was delivering milk. He was hauling 10-gallon containers despite worsening arthritis. These things are really heavy. He augmented his income by selling lottery tickets at a time when no government-sanctioned lottery actually existed. He was arrested in the spring of 1942 during a nationwide sweep by the FBI, but he refused to reveal the source of the tickets or any of the people he had sold the tickets to. He was found guilty. He was fined $10 and spent 30 days in jail in 1943. The two guys who were caught with him begged the judge not to have him serve time. It didn't work. He was even loved by the Crooksy Association. By 1945, Jimmy could no longer move without pain. Ed Stump hired him to work in a service station he owned in Lancaster. Most people who stopped for gas had no idea they were asking a baseball veteran to fill her up. But Jimmy was glad to have a job where he could interact with the public again. He was always quick with a joke or a wisecrack. That season, 1945, Jimmy followed the Cubs as they won the pennant, and he also checked the box scores to see how Eddie Stanky of the Giants was doing. Stanky was drawing walks in bunches that year, and he got his 148th walk on the final day of the season to break Jimmy's National League record. Around this time, there was a story circulating about how Jimmy had invented the original flip-down sunglasses, which players used up until about 15 or 20 years ago. I couldn't find any evidence of this. Fred Clark, another famous outfielder, did receive a patent in 1915, so maybe the two were confused at some point. If Jimmy had, he probably wouldn't, have had such a hard time after baseball. I think Fred Clark made a lot of money off of that. He certainly wouldn't have been working at the Philly station, Lancaster. It was the early morning of January 12, 1947, while Jimmy was walking to work along Manheim Pike, he was struck and killed by an automobile near where it meets Fruitville Pike near the train station. The man who hit Jimmy knew him. He He had been the executive secretary of the Franklin Marshall Alumni Association, so they interacted many, many times. Jimmy's death was ruled an accident. A memorial committee was formed to raise money for a large granite monument in his honor at Stump Field. At a fundraising event, the old umpire Bill Clem, with whom Jimmy had had more than a few run-ins, was the featured speaker. During a committee dinner, Clem was asked if it was true whether, when a good umpire makes a bad call, if he balances that out with a make-up call the next time there's a close decision. Without even looking up from his plate, Clem said, "A good umpire doesn't make a bad call." And at that moment, everyone at the table must have had the same thought. Jimmy Sheckard might have something to say. Anyway, so that's the life of Jimmy Sheckard. Thank you for coming, and I'm open for anybody.
Is there any questions for Mark? Any questions?
1947. Very close to yes, exactly. He actually lingered on for, to the next day.
So when he was jumping Jimmy and was going from contract to contract, was he returning those advances?
I know for a fact he kept one. He pocketed $1,000 from John. But that's what it is to be a star athlete. Today, back then, you get away with murder. Any other questions? Sorry? When the whole thing started, all of the so-called mortals got in, the obvious choices. And then there was a period in the 50s and 60s where people, in addition to people like Joe DiMaggio, retiring, you got in. A lot of people got in were sort of second-tier people, and a lot of that had to do with lobbying from friends and lobbying on their own behalf. And in the 50s and 60s, there were a lot of people got the whole thing. And now you look back at it and say, there's 50 people who were not as good as Jimmy Sheckard, but he wasn't around to advocate for himself. So I think that might have something to do with it. Also, it gets back to this whole thing I looked at. The black ink is there, but it's all over the place. Who was he? And the farther away you get from people who have living memories of him, the harder it is to say he was better, or good enough, or how do you explain this? One year he batted .230. Well, that year he was getting on base like a batting sheet. So sometimes the statistics don't tell the whole story. We had someone here, Greg Dobbs, who did the original biographical work on Jimmy Sheckard. Only years ago. But you knew Les Bell, one of the players that he developed, and so you talked to someone who had vivid living memories. Sometimes that's what it takes. And because of this huge gap, the Hall of Fame a few years ago announced that no one before 1900 is just not, they're not getting in anymore. There's just too much stuff to figure out. So that doesn't help him either, even though he was from the early 1900s. He was a fantastic player, one of the great teams. So all the criteria that you would look for to check all the boxes is pretty much there. So I don't know. Got enough people in this room to sign a petition.
Any more questions? Okay, so he pays for it.
Probably the best baseball players ever made the Hall of Fame in my mind. Bill Floyd's here tonight, and for me, Southbound Valley Sports Hall of Fame has a community service award every year, and it's the Jimmy Sheckard Community Service Award, and I was very proud to win that award the night we dedicated his plaque at Upper Field. So I just say, I'm very proud of that. It's a big moment. I'm not like the Chicago Cubs hat, remember. 11 years ago, already goes so fast, but it was tremendous knowing, I knew almost the whole story, but it was wonderful to hear from Mark again, that he was a tremendous athlete, and like I said, certainly should have been in the Hall of Fame, probably the best baseball player that is not in the Hall of Fame.
A lot of his greatness happened between his ears. Sometimes that doesn't, show up in statistics. I've had this discussion again with Greg, which is they have statistics for everything now except for one thing. You can't have a statistic about what a player prevents another player from doing. How do you quantify that? And that's what the living memory is. That living memory is lost. By the way, there is a great plaque and a great